In the gleaming towers of Seattle's legal district, a junior associate was about to challenge the most powerful law firm in the Pacific Northwest. What started as routine archive research took a shocking turn when she came face to face with decades of buried corruption. Sophie Martinez wasn't your typical corporate lawyer. For 3 years, she had spent her life enduring systematic humiliation at Whitmore Associates, known for her methodical brilliance that colleagues dismissed as irrelevant. When she discovered a explosive contract hidden in dusty files, she had no idea she was walking into a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of legal power. Sophie's decision to expose the truth would lead to federal investigations and congressional hearings. What began as professional survival would become total warfare. The entire Seattle legal establishment would never be the same after one deadweight associate decided to drop her bombshell. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sophie Martinez adjusted her reading glasses and squared her shoulders as she entered the mahogany-paneled conference room on the 42nd floor of Whitmore Associates. The Seattle skyline stretched beyond floor-to-ceiling windows, but her attention focused on the thick folder in her hands. 3 weeks of meticulous research condensed into what she believed was a bulletproof legal strategy. The room fell silent as she took her seat at the far end of the polished table, the spot reserved for junior associates. Richard Whitmore commanded the head of the table like a king holding court, his silver hair perfectly styled, his Harvard law pin catching the morning light. To his right sat Amanda Sterling, CEO of Nexus Technologies, her calculating gaze sweeping the room with the precision of someone who'd built a tech empire from nothing. "Before we begin," Sophie said, opening her folder, "I've identified several precedent cases that could significantly strengthen our defense strategy. The Morrison v. Dataflow ruling from 2019 establishes." Sophie Whitmore's voice cut through her presentation like a blade. "I appreciate your enthusiasm, but let's leave the strategic thinking to those with actual courtroom experience." Heat crept up Sophie's neck. 3 years of this. 3 years of being dismissed, overlooked, relegated to document review, while less qualified associates with the right connections advanced past her. "Sir, with respect, I've analyzed every similar case from the past decade. The data clearly shows data." Whitmore's laugh held no warmth. "Ms. Martinez, this isn't law school anymore. Real litigation isn't won by burying yourself in dusty books and playing with statistics." James Morrison, seated halfway down the table, shifted uncomfortably. Sophie caught his eye, hoping for support, but he looked away. Like the others, he'd learned that defending her was career suicide. Amanda Sterling leaned forward slightly, her expression unreadable. "What exactly are you proposing, Ms. Martinez?" "A motion to dismiss based on statute of limitations violations in the class certification. If we can demonstrate that the plaintiff's claims regarding data harvesting practices extend beyond the allowable time frame." Deadweight thinking. Whitmore's words landed like a physical blow. "This is exactly the kind of academic theorizing that wastes billable hours and loses cases." "Amanda, I apologize for this interruption." The silence that followed felt suffocating. Sophie's carefully prepared arguments died in her throat as every face in the room turned away from her, colleagues suddenly finding their notebooks fascinating. The betrayal cut deeper than Whitmore's cruelty. She'd expected his dismissal, but the collective abandonment by her peers hit like ice water. Amanda Sterling studied Sophie with renewed interest, her eyes sharp with a different kind of calculation. "Actually, Richard, I'd like to hear more about these precedent cases." Whitmore's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course, but perhaps we could discuss substantive matters first. The exposure here is potentially catastrophic. We're looking at damages that could reach into the billions." Sophie forced herself to listen as Whitmore outlined the lawsuit's scope. Nexus Technologies faced allegations of systematic privacy violations, unauthorized data collection, and manipulation of user information spanning nearly 2 decades. The plaintiffs' coalition included privacy advocates, consumer groups, and thousands of individual users whose personal data had been harvested without consent. "The media attention alone could destroy us," Sterling said quietly. Even if we win, the discovery process will expose practices that, well, that might be difficult to explain in today's climate. Which is why, Whitmore continued, shooting Sophie a warning glance, we need aggressive, experienced counsel, not academic theorizing. The meeting dragged on for another hour, with Sophie relegated to silent observer status. She watched the interplay between Whitmore and Sterling, noting the subtle tensions beneath their professional facade. There was history there, something deeper than a typical attorney-client relationship. As colleagues filed out, exchanging knowing looks and quiet conversations, Sophie remained seated. The folder of research lay untouched before her, her work dismissed without consideration. Sophie. James Morrison paused by her chair. Maybe next time. Next time what, James? Next time I should just sit quietly and let incompetence masquerade as experience? He glanced toward the door where Whitmore's voice echoed in the hallway. Look, I know it's frustrating, but Whitmore's got 30 years of getting by on reputation while better lawyers do the actual work. Sophie's voice carried an edge she rarely allowed others to hear. You know my analysis was solid. James's expression softened with what might have been guilt. It doesn't matter if you're right, Sophie. What matters is surviving here long enough to make a difference. After he left, Sophie sat alone in the empty conference room, Seattle's skyline blurred through her tears of rage. Her parents' faces flashed through her mind, her father's calloused hands from years of construction work, her mother's exhaustion after double shifts at the diner. They'd sacrificed everything for her education, believing that knowledge and hard work would be enough. I'll show them dead weight, she whispered to the empty room. Standing slowly, Sophie gathered her dismissed research and headed for the door. The firm's archives beckoned, thousands of old cases, contracts, and documents that most associates avoided like plague duty. But Sophie had always found solace in thorough research, in the methodical pursuit of truth that others found tedious. If Whitmore wanted her buried in dusty files, she'd dig deeper than anyone expected. Sometimes the most powerful weapons were hidden in the places nobody bothered to look. The elevator descended into the building's basement with a mechanical groan that seemed to echo Sophie's mood. The archives of Whitmore and Associates occupied 2 full floors beneath street level, a labyrinth of filing cabinets, document boxes, and forgotten legal histories that stretched back to the firm's founding in 1952. Sophie's footsteps echoed in the sterile corridor as she made her way past rows of climate-controlled storage. Most associates dreaded archive duty, but she'd always found a strange comfort in the methodical organization of legal precedent. Here, merit mattered more than politics. Here, the truth waited patiently in manila folders and bound volumes. She settled at a metal desk surrounded by towers of boxes marked Nexus Technologies, Historical. Her plan was simple: trace every legal interaction between the firm and Sterling's company, looking for patterns, precedents, anything that might provide insight into the current crisis. The first box contained routine corporate filings from the past 5 years, incorporation documents, contract amendments, quarterly compliance reports. Sophie worked with practiced efficiency, her trained eye scanning for anomalies or inconsistencies. The second box revealed similar material from the previous decade, but as she dug deeper, the documents grew more interesting. A licensing agreement from 2015 caught her attention. The language was oddly specific about data collection methodologies, with clauses that seemed to anticipate legal challenges that wouldn't emerge for years. Someone had been planning for exactly the kind of lawsuit Nexus now faced. Clever, she murmured, photographing the relevant pages with her phone. But not clever enough. The third box sent her back further in time, to the early 2000s, when Nexus was still a scrappy startup operating out of a Seattle garage. The legal documents from this period had a different quality. Hungrier, more desperate. These were the contracts of people who had everything to lose and nothing left to sacrifice. Sophie's breath caught as she opened a manila folder marked Foundational Partnership Agreement, 2001. The document inside looked innocuous enough, a standard partnership agreement between Whitmore and Associates and a small tech company called Nexus Innovations, LLC. But as Sophie studied the fine print, her legal training began connecting dots that painted a disturbing picture. The agreement wasn't just for legal representation. It established Whitmore Associates as a silent partner in Nexus's core operations, with specific provisions for data acquisition, user profiling, and what the contract euphemistically called behavioral analysis protocols. Sophie's hands trembled slightly as she photographed each page. The signatures at the bottom made her pulse quicken. Amanda L. Sterling, founder, in a younger, less confident handwriting, and Richard J. Whitmore III, managing partner, in the same bold script that still graced his correspondence today. But it was the addendum that made Sophie's blood run cold. Buried in subsection 4.7c, a clause that most lawyers would skim past as boilerplate language, was a provision that granted Whitmore Associates access to all user data collected by Nexus for, quote, legal research and risk assessment purposes. The implications hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't just attorney-client privilege. This was systematic data harvesting disguised as legal cooperation. For over 20 years, Whitmore Associates had been complicit in the very practices that now threatened to destroy both firms. Sophie leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. The current lawsuit wasn't just about Nexus's privacy violations. It was about a conspiracy that reached into the heart of one of Seattle's most prestigious law firms. Richard Whitmore hadn't just been representing a client, he'd been protecting a co-conspirator. She thought about the morning's meeting, about Whitmore's dismissive cruelty and his obvious anxiety about the lawsuit's scope. Now she understood why he'd been so hostile to her research-based approach. He wasn't worried about losing the case. He was terrified of what discovery might reveal. The irony wasn't lost on her. Whitmore had spent 3 years calling her work irrelevant, her methods outdated, her contributions worthless. And now, buried in the very archives he'd banished her to, she'd found evidence that could destroy everything he'd built. Sophie carefully photographed the contract from multiple angles, ensuring every clause and signature was clearly documented. Her phone's memory filled with images of legal dynamite, evidence of fraud, conspiracy, and systematic violation of client privacy that stretched back 2 decades. As she prepared to close the file, a loose document slipped from the back of the folder. It was a handwritten note on Whitmore's personal letterhead, dated just 3 months after the original contract signing. Amanda, the user profiling data you've provided has exceeded all expectations. Our ability to anticipate client needs and predict legal challenges has improved dramatically. I foresee a very profitable future for both our organizations. Sophie stared at the note, its implications crashing over her like a tide. This wasn't just about privacy violations or data harvesting. Whitmore Associates had been using stolen user data to gain unfair advantages in legal proceedings, to anticipate opposing counsel's strategies, to manipulate the very system they were sworn to uphold. The conference room humiliation suddenly seemed trivial compared to this revelation. Sophie Martinez, the dead-weight junior associate who supposedly lacked real-world experience, had just uncovered the biggest legal scandal in Seattle's history. She slipped the handwritten note back into the folder and closed the box, her mind already calculating her next moves. The document was explosive, but it was also dangerous. Whitmore had spent 20 years building firewalls around this secret, and he wouldn't hesitate to destroy anyone who threatened to expose it. But as Sophie sat in the quiet archives surrounded by decades of legal history, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years at the firm. Power. Real, tangible power that came not from connections or politics, but from knowledge and truth. Richard Whitmore had called her dead weight. Now she'd see exactly how much damage dead weight could do when it finally decided to drop. Sophie's hands shook as she dialed the number she'd found on the Legal Ethics Foundation website. 3 days had passed since her discovery in the archives, 3 days of sleepless nights and careful planning. She'd researched Dr. Sarah Thompson extensively, former Whitmore associate, whistleblower advocate, someone who might understand the magnitude of what she'd uncovered. Legal Ethics Foundation, this is Sarah. Dr. Thompson? My name is Sophie Martinez. I'm a junior associate at Whitmore Associates, and I need some career guidance. A pause. Then, more carefully, what kind of guidance, Ms. Martinez? Sophie chose her words deliberately. I've discovered some historical documents that raise questions about professional responsibility. Documents that might affect ongoing litigation. Another pause, longer this time. When Sarah spoke again, her voice carried a weight that suggested she understood exactly what kind of call this was. I think we should meet in person. Do you know the Cherry Street Coffee House near Pike Place Market? Yes. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. Order a regular coffee and sit by the window overlooking the Sound. I'll find you. The coffee shop buzzed with morning energy when Sophie arrived, laptop bag slung over her shoulder, the weight of printed documents making her feel like she was carrying explosives. She ordered her coffee and chose a corner table where she could watch both the entrance and the street outside. Dr. Sarah Thompson looked exactly like her website photo, mid-50s, silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. But in person, there was something else, a wariness that spoke of hard-won experience with dangerous truths. Sophie Martinez? Sarah settled into the opposite chair, her own coffee in hand. You look younger than I expected. Young enough to be naive? Old enough to know better? Sarah's smile was knowing. Something like that. You mentioned historical documents. Sophie glanced around the coffee shop, noting the business people absorbed in their phones, the tourists planning their day. How do you know when you've found something that could change everything? When you stop sleeping at night and start looking over your shoulder. Sarah leaned forward. What did you find, Sophie? The name felt like a key turning in a lock. Sophie pulled out a manila folder, keeping it below table level. A partnership agreement from 2001 between Whitmore and Associates and Nexus Technologies, with provisions that, she swallowed hard, that establish a pattern of systematic data harvesting disguised as legal research. Sarah's expression didn't change, but Sophie caught the slight tightening around her eyes. Richard Whitmore's signature? Yes, along with Amanda Sterling's. And you understand the implications of what you're telling me? Sophie nodded. 20 years of privacy violations. Conspiracy. Using stolen user data to gain advantages in legal proceedings. And now they're representing the same client in a lawsuit about the very practices they helped establish. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of old pain. I worked at Whitmore and Associates for 8 years. Left in 2009. Why? Because I suspected something like this existed, but I could never prove it. Richard Whitmore is brilliant at compartmentalizing information, at making sure no single person sees the whole picture. Sarah's fingers drummed against her coffee cup. Except now you have. What do I do with it? Sarah studied Sophie's face with the intensity of someone reading a client's character. First question. Why are you telling me this? What do you want? Sophie had been asking herself the same question for 3 days. I want justice. I want the truth to matter more than politics and connections. I want... She paused, remembering the conference room humiliation. I want them to understand that competence isn't determined by who you know or where you went to school. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. And you're willing to sacrifice your career for that? What career? I'm already dead weight, remember? Sarah's laugh was sharp with recognition. Oh, I remember that feeling. The question is, are you prepared for what comes next? Because once you open this door, there's no closing it. Whitmore will use every resource at his disposal to destroy you. He'll question your competence, your motives, your mental state. He'll make you unemployable in legal circles. Sophie thought about her parents, about the sacrifices they'd made to get her through law school. What's the alternative? Let him continue destroying people's lives while hiding behind professional privilege? There's always the alternative of self-preservation. Most people choose it. You didn't. Sarah's smile was sad. No, I didn't, and it cost me everything I thought I wanted. But it gave me something more important, the ability to look at myself in the mirror. They sat in silence, watching Seattle's morning fog roll across Elliott Bay. Sophie felt the weight of decisions settling on her shoulders like a mantle she couldn't remove. If I decide to move forward, Sophie said finally, I'll need guidance. Someone who understands how these systems work, how to navigate the aftermath. You'll need more than guidance. You'll need allies, resources, and a strategy that accounts for Whitmore's response. Sarah pulled out a business card and wrote a phone number on the back. This is my personal cell. If you decide to proceed, call me. But Sophie, once we start this process, there's no guarantee of how it ends. Justice isn't always the same thing as victory. Sophie took the card, its weight surprisingly heavy in her palm. Dr. Thompson, when you left Whitmore Associates, did you regret it? Sarah gathered her purse and stood. I regretted not doing it sooner. She paused at Sophie's shoulder. And Sophie? That document you found. It's not just evidence of past crimes. It's the foundation for current ones. Every case Whitmore has won in the past 20 years could be tainted by illegally obtained data. You're not just holding dynamite. You're holding the key to unwinding 2 decades of corrupted justice. As Sarah walked away, Sophie stared out at the sound, her reflection ghost-like in the window. The cheerful bustle of the coffee shop seemed to happen in a different world, one where junior associates worried about billable hours and performance reviews, not about conspiracies that reached into the heart of the legal system. She thought about Richard Whitmore's dismissive cruelty, about James Morrison's cowardice, about all the competent people who'd been overlooked in favor of those with the right connections. The document in her bag wasn't just evidence. It was vindication for everyone who'd been told their work didn't matter. Sophie finished her coffee and headed back toward the office, Sarah's business card burning in her pocket like a promise. The fog was beginning to lift, revealing the city in sharp detail. For the first time in 3 years, she could see clearly what needed to be done. The elevator ride back to the 42nd floor felt different now. Sophie carried herself with a subtle confidence that came from holding dangerous knowledge, but she forced her expression into its usual mask of professional neutrality. The key to survival would be acting exactly as she always had, while everything inside her had changed. James Morrison looked up from his desk as she passed, his expression guilty in the way it had been since the conference room incident. Sophie, how's the archive research going? She paused, calculating. James had shown flashes of conscience before, moments when his moral compass fought against his survival instincts. If she was going to build any kind of support within the firm, he would be her most likely ally. Productive. I'm finding some interesting historical patterns. She kept her voice carefully neutral. Want to grab coffee later? I could use a second pair of eyes on some procedural questions. Relief flickered across his features. Sure. The usual place downstairs at 4, the firm's employee cafe, occupied a corner of the 38th floor, far enough from the executive offices to provide relative privacy. Sophie arrived first, choosing a table near the windows where their conversation would be masked by the ambient noise of other employees. James slid into the opposite chair, his coffee trembling slightly in his hands. Look, Sophie, about the other day. Forget it. Sophie's tone was matter-of-fact. I'm more interested in your thoughts on something else. In your 7 years here, have you ever noticed anything unusual about how Whitmore handles certain cases? His wariness was immediate. What do you mean, unusual? Patterns. Like how he always seems to anticipate opposing counsel's strategies, or how he has access to information that shouldn't be available through normal discovery channels. James was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. There was a case 3 years ago. Personal injury suit against one of our corporate clients. The plaintiff's attorney was preparing a settlement demand, hadn't filed anything yet. But somehow Whitmore knew the exact amount they were considering. Sophie's pulse quickened. How did he explain that? Said he had good instincts for reading people. But James hesitated. The plaintiff's lawyer mentioned in passing that he'd only discussed the number in private emails with his client. No phones, no meetings. Just encrypted email. What happened to the case? Settled quickly, barely a tenth of what the plaintiff was originally considering. James's expression darkened. The client was a single mother whose husband died in an industrial accident. She needed the money desperately. Sophie felt the familiar burn of injustice, but she kept her voice level. Any other cases like that? Too many to count. Whitmore always seems to know exactly what buttons to push, exactly what arguments will work. I used to think he was just brilliant at reading people, but... He shook his head. There's something else. The IT department has been asking weird questions lately about email security, about whether attorneys have been accessing systems they shouldn't. The conversation was interrupted by footsteps. Richard Whitmore approached their table, his presence immediately changing the atmosphere. Ms. Martinez. Mr. Morrison. His tone was cordial, but his eyes were calculating. How's the archive research progressing? Very well, sir. I'm uncovering some fascinating historical precedents. Whitmore's smile didn't reach his eyes. I hope you're not getting too lost in ancient history. The current crisis requires forward-thinking solutions, not academic archaeology. Of course, sir. Though sometimes understanding the past provides crucial context for present challenges. Something flickered in Whitmore's expression, a moment of genuine wariness. Indeed. Well, don't let me interrupt your coffee break, though perhaps your time would be better spent on current billable work rather than... He gestured vaguely. Historical curiosities. As he walked away, James exhaled slowly. That was pointed. He's worried about something. Sophie watched Whitmore's retreating figure. James, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. If you discovered that this firm was engaged in systematic ethical violations that harmed innocent people, what would you do? The question hung between them like a live wire. James stared into his coffee, his internal struggle visible on his face. My parents are getting older, he said finally. My dad's pension got gutted when the auto plant closed, and my mom needs medication that costs $1,200 a month. This job, it's the only thing standing between them and financial ruin. Sophie felt a stab of empathy. She understood the weight of family obligation, the pressure of being the first generation to achieve professional success. I'm not asking you to quit, James. I'm asking what you'd do if you knew people were being hurt. I'd want to do the right thing. His voice was barely audible. But wanting and being able to are different things. What if there was a way to do the right thing that didn't require you to sacrifice everything? What if there was a way to expose the truth while protecting yourself? James looked up sharply. Sophie, what are you talking about? She leaned forward, lowering her voice. I'm talking about making sure that competence matters more than connections, that justice matters more than billable hours, that the sacrifices our families made to get us here actually mean something. The weight of her words settled between them. James's expression shifted as he recognized the seriousness of what she was implying. What did you find in those archives? Sophie glanced around the cafe, noting who was within earshot. Evidence that this firm has been complicit in systematic privacy violations for over 20 years. Evidence that could expose a conspiracy reaching into the heart of the legal system. James went pale. Sophie, you can't be serious. I've never been more serious about anything in my life. Do you understand what you're suggesting? Whitmore has connections everywhere. Judges, prosecutors, regulatory agencies. If you try to expose him and fail, then I fail, knowing I tried to do the right thing instead of enabling corruption. James was quiet for several minutes, his mind clearly racing through implications and consequences. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a new resolve. What do you need from me? Sophie felt a surge of hope mixed with fear. She was no longer alone in this fight, but she'd also just made James complicit in whatever came next. For now, just keep your eyes open. Document anything unusual you observe. And James, she met his gaze directly. Once we start down this path, there's no going back. Are you sure you're ready for that? He nodded slowly. I'm tired of being afraid, tired of watching good people get destroyed while corruption flourishes. His jaw tightened with determination. My parents didn't sacrifice everything so I could become part of the problem. As they gathered their things to return to work, Sophie felt the dangerous thrill of having crossed a line. She was no longer a lone voice in the wilderness. She had an ally, someone who understood the stakes and was willing to act despite the risks. But as they walked back toward the elevators, She caught sight of Whitmore watching them from across the floor, his expression unreadable, but undeniably focused. The game had already begun, and he was starting to realize that his dismissive, dead weight might be more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. The emergency meeting was called for 7 a.m., dragging exhausted associates and partners into the main conference room before Seattle's dawn had fully broken. Sophie arrived early, her usual strategy for remaining invisible while observing everything. The tension in the room was palpable. Phone calls from angry clients, media inquiries that couldn't be deflected, and the growing specter of a lawsuit that threatened to consume everything. Richard Whitmore entered like a general preparing for war, his usual polished composure replaced by something harder and more desperate. Amanda Sterling followed close behind, her face drawn with the weight of someone watching her empire crumble in real time. The situation has deteriorated faster than anticipated, Whitmore began without preamble. The class action lawsuit has attracted congressional attention. Privacy advocates are demanding federal investigation, and our media strategy has been completely ineffective. Sophie watched the faces around the table, noting how seasoned partners who usually radiated confidence now looked uncertain, even frightened. This wasn't just about legal strategy anymore. This was about survival. The plaintiff's legal team is being led by Morrison and Associates, Sterling added, her voice tight with controlled anger. They're claiming they have inside information about our data collection practices, evidence of systematic privacy violations dating back to our company's founding. A chill ran down Sophie's spine. If the opposing counsel already suspected the connection between Nexus and Whitmore and Associates, her discovered contract might not be the smoking gun she'd thought. It might be confirmation of what they already knew. Which brings us to our response strategy, Whitmore continued. We need to be more aggressive in discrediting the plaintiffs and their counsel. I'm proposing we launch a comprehensive investigation into the personal lives of the lead plaintiffs, looking for anything that might compromise their credibility. James Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Sophie caught his eye and saw her own disgust reflected there. Define, quote, comprehensive investigation, said Margaret Chen, one of the senior partners. Whitmore's smile was cold. Financial records, employment history, medical records, social media activity, personal relationships. Anything that might suggest ulterior motives or questionable character. Richard, Margaret's voice carried a warning. That sounds dangerously close to harassment. It sounds like thorough advocacy for our client. Whitmore's tone brooked no argument. These people are trying to destroy a company that employs thousands and contributes billions to the economy. If they want to position themselves as crusaders for justice, they'd better be prepared for scrutiny. Sophie felt her stomach turn. The people suing Nexus were victims, individuals whose private information had been harvested, manipulated, and sold without their knowledge or consent. Now Whitmore wanted to victimize them again by invading their privacy even further. What about the legal risks? Asked another partner. If our investigation methods cross ethical lines, leave the ethics to me, Whitmore snapped. Your job is to win this case by any means necessary. The meeting continued for another hour, with detailed discussions of investigative tactics that grew increasingly questionable. Sophie took careful notes, documenting every proposal that violated legal ethics or basic human decency. By the time they adjourned, she had enough evidence of planned misconduct to destroy several careers. As colleagues filed out, Sophie lingered, gathering her materials slowly. She was almost alone when her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Ms. Martinez, this is Marcus Webb from the Seattle Tribune. I'd like to speak with you about irregularities in legal representation at major Seattle firms. Could we meet today? Sophie's blood ran cold. Marcus Webb was the investigative journalist who'd been digging into corporate corruption throughout the Pacific Northwest. If he was contacting her directly, it meant her involvement was already suspected by people outside the firm. She typed back carefully, I'm not sure what you're referring to. Perhaps you've confused me with someone else. The response came immediately. I don't think so. Your name appears on several public filings related to Nexus Technologies, and sources suggest you've been conducting unusual research into historical corporate relationships. I'm not trying to trap anyone. I'm trying to expose systematic corruption that's harming ordinary people." Sophie stared at her phone, her mind racing. Webb's contact represented both opportunity and danger. He could be the ally she needed to expose the truth. Or he could be the catalyst that destroyed her before she was ready to act. Another text arrived. "I'll be at Vic's Coffee on Pine Street at 2 p.m. today. If you decide you want to talk, I'll be there. If not, I understand. But Ms. Martinez, sometimes staying silent makes us complicit in the very corruption we claim to oppose." The words hit like a physical blow. Sophie thought about the morning's meeting, about Whitmore's plan to further victimize people who were already suffering, about James Morrison's quiet desperation and her own parents' sacrifices, about 20 years of corrupted justice and the lives destroyed by a system that protected wealth and connections over truth and fairness. She looked around the now empty conference room, with its mahogany paneling and panoramic views of Seattle's skyline. Everything about Whitmore and Associates was designed to project power and respectability, but underneath the polished surface lay rot that had been festering for decades. Sophie made her decision. She texted James, "Emergency coffee meeting. Usual place, 1 p.m. We need to talk." Then she deleted Webb's messages and slipped her phone back into her purse. The pressure cooker was about to explode, and she needed to decide whether she'd be caught in the blast or positioned to control the explosion. As she gathered her notes from the morning meeting, evidence of planned misconduct that could end careers and expose systematic corruption, Sophie felt the familiar weight of dangerous knowledge. But this time it was accompanied by something new, the certainty that silence was no longer an option. Richard Whitmore had spent 3 years dismissing her as dead weight. Now he was about to discover that sometimes the most dangerous explosions come from the smallest, most overlooked sources. The game was about to change, and Sophie Martinez was finally ready to play. Sophie's hands trembled as she created the anonymous email account, choosing the name SeattleLegal_Truth with methodical precision. Marcus Webb's investigative articles had been building momentum for weeks, each piece revealing another layer of corporate corruption in Seattle's legal community. Now she would give him the ammunition to blow the whole system apart. The meeting with James had been brief but decisive. He'd brought his own evidence, screenshots of suspicious email traffic, records of cases where Whitmore had impossible insider knowledge, documentation of the firm's systematic targeting of vulnerable plaintiffs. Together, they'd assembled a compelling narrative of corruption that spanned 2 decades. But Sophie kept the original contract to herself. That nuclear weapon would remain in her control until the moment was right. She typed carefully, crafting her first message to Webb. "Mr. Webb, I'm a concerned legal professional who has been following your investigation into corporate corruption. I have evidence of systematic privacy violations and unethical practices at a major Seattle law firm that directly relate to your recent articles about data harvesting. The attached documents represent only a fraction of what I've uncovered. If you're interested in pursuing this story, I can provide more substantial evidence through secure channels." Sophie attached selected documents, enough to prove her credibility without revealing the full scope of her discovery. James's evidence of insider knowledge, records of suspicious case patterns, and carefully redacted portions of historical contracts that hinted at deeper corruption. She hit send before she could reconsider. The response came within 2 hours. Webb's reply was professional but urgent. "Your evidence corroborates information I've been gathering from multiple sources. This appears to be significantly larger than I initially suspected. Can you provide documentation of the relationship between the law firm and specific technology companies? I'm particularly interested in any historical partnerships or unusual fee arrangements." Sophie smiled grimly. Webb was good. He was already connecting dots she hadn't explicitly drawn for him. The Seattle Tribune's website updated at 6 a.m. the next morning with Webb's explosive article, "Inside Seattle's Legal Elite: How Major Law Firms May Be Complicit in Systematic Privacy Violations." The piece didn't name Whitmore and Associates directly, but anyone familiar with the local legal community would recognize the firm from Webb's detailed descriptions. Sophie arrived at the office to find chaos. Partners huddled in worried conversations, associates whispered anxiously in hallways, and the usual morning efficiency had been replaced by a paranoid tension that permeated every floor. Richard Whitmore's voice echoed from the main conference room, where an emergency meeting was already underway. Sophie slipped into her workstation, maintaining her usual routine while internally cataloging every panicked reaction around her. "Everyone, stop what you're doing," Whitmore's voice carried down the hallway as the conference room doors opened. "We have a security breach, and I want to know who's responsible." The witch hunt began immediately. IT staff appeared with laptop seizure orders, demanding access to personal devices and email accounts. Associates were called into individual meetings with HR and senior partners, their loyalty questioned, their communications scrutinized. Sophie submitted to the investigation with perfect compliance, knowing her anonymous email account was untraceable, and her evidence collection had been methodical enough to avoid detection. She watched colleagues crack under pressure, some revealing minor indiscretions, others pointing fingers at perceived rivals. James Morrison handled his interrogation with surprising calm, his years of quiet observation serving him well. When questioned about his knowledge of any leaks, he simply stated that he'd noticed unusual patterns in case handling, but had assumed they reflected Whitmore's superior strategic thinking. By midday, the firm's clients were calling with uncomfortable questions. Amanda Sterling arrived for an emergency meeting, her usual composure replaced by barely controlled rage. Sophie caught glimpses of the heated discussion through conference room windows. Sterling's animated gestures, Whitmore's defensive posture, other partners scrambling to contain damage that was already spreading beyond their control. The afternoon brought more revelations as Webb's follow-up articles appeared online. He'd clearly been sitting on additional sources, waiting for the right moment to deploy them. Each new piece revealed another layer of corruption, another example of legal ethics violations, another connection between Seattle's legal elite and the technology companies they supposedly regulated. Sophie's phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Sarah Thompson. "I assume you're behind the Tribune articles. Well done, but be prepared. Whitmore's response will be vicious. He's not just fighting for his reputation now, he's fighting for his freedom." The warning proved prescient. By evening, word spread through the firm that Whitmore had hired a private investigation company to identify the source of the leaks. The paranoid atmosphere intensified as colleagues began suspecting each other, relationships fracturing under the pressure of mutual distrust. Sophie worked late that night, ostensibly catching up on routine tasks while actually monitoring the firm's response to her first strike. The satisfaction she felt was complicated by awareness of what she'd set in motion. There would be casualties in this war, innocent people whose careers would be damaged by their association with a corrupt system. But as she thought about the victims of Nexus's data harvesting, about the single mother whose settlement had been manipulated through stolen information, about 20 years of corrupted justice, Sophie's resolve hardened. Richard Whitmore had called her dead weight. Tomorrow, she would show him exactly how much damage dead weight could inflict when it finally decided to fall. The building's security guard nodded to her as she left, unaware that the quiet junior associate he'd been greeting for 3 years had just fired the first shot in a war that would reshape Seattle's legal landscape forever. The knock on Sophie's apartment door came at 6:47 a.m., sharp and authoritative in a way that made her blood freeze. Through the peephole, she saw Richard Whitmore flanked by 2 men in expensive suits. Private investigators, she realized, recognizing the type from her criminal law courses. "Ms. Martinez," Whitmore's voice carried through the door with false courtesy. "I'd like to speak with you about recent developments at the firm." Sophie's mind raced. Her laptop with the encrypted files was hidden in a safety deposit box across town, her phone contained nothing incriminating, and her apartment had been carefully sanitized of any physical evidence. But Whitmore's presence here meant he'd narrowed his suspects considerably. She opened the door with practiced calm. "Mr. Whitmore, this is unexpected. May we come in? I think you'll find our conversation enlightening." The apartment felt smaller with Whitmore's presence filling it. He moved through her living space like a predator establishing territory, his investigators positioning themselves near the windows and door. Sophie recognized the intimidation tactic, but forced herself to project innocent confusion. I understand you've been conducting extensive research into the firm's historical files, Whitmore began, settling into her armchair without invitation. Finding anything interesting? Just precedent cases for the Nexus defense, as you requested. Of course. His smile was razor sharp. Though I'm curious about your after-hours activities. My security team tells me you've been staying quite late in the archives. Sophie felt sweat gathering between her shoulder blades but kept her voice steady. I'm thorough in my work, sir. I thought you'd appreciate the dedication. I do appreciate dedication. What I don't appreciate is betrayal. Whitmore leaned forward, his mask of civility slipping. Someone has been feeding information to Marcus Webb, someone with access to confidential files and detailed knowledge of our client relationships. That's disturbing. Do you have any leads? The question seemed to amuse him. Several. But I thought I'd start with the most obvious suspect, the disgruntled junior associate who's been systematically undermined by the firm's partnership structure. Sophie's heart hammered against her ribs, but she met his gaze directly. If you're suggesting I violated client confidentiality, I'd be happy to submit to any investigation. My work speaks for itself. Indeed it does. Whitmore stood abruptly, his investigators moving with practiced coordination. Which is why you won't mind if we take a look around. Professional courtesy, of course. The search was thorough but fruitless. Sophie watched them examine her bookshelf, her desk, her computer, finding nothing more incriminating than law school textbooks and routine work files. But she could see Whitmore's frustration growing with each empty drawer, each clean hard drive. You're very careful, Ms. Martinez. Almost suspiciously so. I'm organized. It's a survival skill in your firm. The verbal sparring continued for 20 minutes, Whitmore probing for weakness while Sophie deflected with carefully neutral responses. But the real battle was psychological, each trying to determine what the other actually knew, what evidence existed, what consequences might follow. Finally, Whitmore stood to leave. Ms. Martinez, I want you to understand something very clearly. This firm has weathered many storms over the decades. We've survived because we understand loyalty, discretion, and the importance of protecting our institutional integrity. I understand completely, sir. I hope you do. Because disloyalty, hypothetical disloyalty, you understand, would have consequences that extend far beyond professional disappointment. The legal community is smaller than you might think, and reputations, once damaged, are very difficult to repair. The threat was unmistakable. Sophie nodded as if accepting sage advice rather than a warning that her career and future were being held hostage. After they left, Sophie sat in her violated apartment, shaking with a combination of fear and rage. Whitmore's visit confirmed that her cover was blown, that she was now operating in open warfare rather than stealth investigation. The careful game of cat and mouse was over. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus Webb. Major development. Congressional subcommittee announcing formal investigation into Seattle legal practices. Multiple firms being scrutinized. Can we meet today? Sophie stared at the message, realizing that events were accelerating beyond her control. Webb's investigation had attracted federal attention, transforming her personal vendetta into a national scandal. The stakes had just multiplied exponentially. She typed back, Vic's coffee, 2 p.m., come alone. The next few hours passed in a blur of preparation. Sophie retrieved her laptop from the safety deposit box, compiled her most damaging evidence, and mentally rehearsed the conversation that would either vindicate her or destroy her completely. Webb was already waiting when she arrived, his expression grim with the weight of someone carrying dangerous knowledge. Ms. Martinez, I presume. Thank you for finally agreeing to meet face-to-face. Thank you for your discretion in handling the information I've provided. About that, I need to prepare you for what's coming. The congressional investigation has created a feeding frenzy. Other journalists are digging into this story. Federal agencies are opening files, and the legal community is starting to panic. Your firm is about to become the center of the biggest corruption scandal in Seattle's history. Sophie felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. What does that mean for the people involved? It means that anyone connected to this story needs to decide which side of history they want to be on. Because when this explodes, and it will explode very soon, there won't be any neutral ground left. Webb leaned across the table, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. I know you have more evidence than what you've shown me. Serious evidence. The kind that could bring down not just Whitmore and Associates, but potentially expose corruption throughout the entire Pacific Northwest legal community. Sophie met his gaze, seeing her own reflection in his glasses. The moment of final decision had arrived, the point where careful planning gave way to irreversible action. Mr. Webb, she said quietly, I think it's time you saw what I really found in those archives. She opened her laptop, her fingers steady now with absolute certainty. Richard Whitmore had spent 3 years calling her dead weight, dismissing her competence, undermining her contributions. Now she would show him the true meaning of underestimation. The war was about to begin in earnest, and Sophie Martinez was finally ready to deploy her nuclear weapons. Sophie's hands were steady as she opened the encrypted folder on her laptop, the original contract and handwritten note appearing on the screen like evidence from another lifetime. Marcus Webb's sharp intake of breath told her he immediately understood the significance of what he was seeing. This is... Webb's voice trailed off as he read Whitmore's handwritten confession of using stolen user data. This is conspiracy, fraud, systematic violation of client privacy spanning 2 decades. Sophie, this doesn't just destroy Whitmore and Associates. This could unravel hundreds of cases, potentially thousands of legal decisions. I know. Sophie's voice carried the weight of someone who'd spent sleepless nights calculating the full implications. Every case they've won in the past 20 years could be tainted. Every settlement they've negotiated could have been manipulated using stolen information. Webb was already making notes, his journalist's instincts taking over. I need to verify this independently, cross-reference it with other sources. But if this is authentic, it's authentic. I've traced the document's provenance, confirmed the signatures through comparison with other legal filings. Richard Whitmore signed this contract, knowing it would enable systematic privacy violations, and he's been profiting from stolen data ever since. The coffee shop around them buzzed with normal morning activity, students studying, business people checking emails, tourists planning their day, none of them aware that they were witnessing the moment when decades of corruption finally came to light. Sophie, I need you to understand what you're about to unleash. This story will make national headlines, congressional investigations, federal criminal prosecutions, civil lawsuits that could bankrupt one of Seattle's most prestigious law firms. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny? Sophie thought about her conversation with Dr. Sarah Thompson, about the price of doing what's right. I'm prepared for the consequences of telling the truth. What I'm not prepared for is continuing to enable a system that destroys innocent people while protecting the corrupt. Webb nodded slowly. I'll need time to build the story properly, to contact federal authorities, to ensure everything is documented correctly. Can you give me 48 hours? I can give you 24. After yesterday's search of my apartment, Whitmore knows I'm the leak. He's going to escalate his efforts to destroy me, and I'd rather strike first. They agreed on a publication timeline, with Webb promising to coordinate with federal investigators to ensure Sophie's evidence reached the appropriate authorities simultaneously with public disclosure. As they prepared to leave, Webb's expression grew concerned. Sophie, I need to ask, do you have somewhere safe to stay? Once this story breaks, Whitmore will view you as an existential threat. The question chilled her more than she'd expected. I'll figure something out. Sarah Thompson has offered to let threatened sources stay at her foundation's safe house. It's designed for whistleblowers who need protection during investigations. 24 hours later, Sophie sat in Dr. Thompson's nonprofit office, watching the Seattle Tribune's website update with Webb's explosive exposé. The headline read, Decades of Corruption: How Seattle's Elite Law Firm Used Stolen Data to Manipulate Justice System. The story was devastating in its thoroughness. Webb had contacted federal authorities who confirmed they were launching a formal investigation. The FBI had issued preservation notices to Whitmore and Associates, freezing all documents and electronic records. The Washington State Bar Association announced an emergency ethics investigation. Sophie's phone rang constantly. Reporters wanting interviews, former colleagues demanding explanations, unknown numbers that might be threats or job offers. She'd turned it off after the 15th call. "How does it feel?" Dr. Thompson asked, settling into the chair beside Sophie's with 2 cups of coffee. "Terrifying. Liberating. Like I've just jumped off a cliff and I'm not sure if I'm flying or falling." "Both, probably. That's what justice feels like when you're the one demanding it." The afternoon brought a parade of developments that validated Sophie's decision while confirming her fears. Federal agents raided Whitmore Associates, seizing computers and files, while partners and associates watched helplessly. Amanda Sterling's company saw its stock price plummet as investors fled. Other Seattle law firms began internal investigations, worried about their own exposure to the spreading scandal. But the personal cost became clear as well. James Morrison called to report that Whitmore had fired Sophie in absentia, claiming she'd violated client confidentiality and professional ethics. Her law school loans remained, but her legal career, at least in traditional practice, was effectively over. "James is holding up well," Dr. Thompson reported after speaking with him. "He's cooperating with federal investigators, providing additional evidence of the firm's misconduct. His courage in corroborating your story will probably save his career." Sophie felt a surge of gratitude mixed with guilt. James had risked everything to support her revelation, and his survival depended on factors beyond either of their control. The evening news confirmed what Sophie had suspected. This wasn't just about Whitmore and Associates anymore. The scandal had exposed a network of corrupt relationships between Seattle's legal elite and major technology companies, with implications reaching into judicial decisions, regulatory enforcement, and corporate governance throughout the Pacific Northwest. "You've started something that will take years to fully resolve," Dr. Thompson observed as they watched the coverage. "Hundreds of cases will be reviewed. Dozens of careers will end. Maybe some people will go to prison. Are you ready for that responsibility?" Sophie stared at the television screen, watching footage of federal agents carrying boxes from the firm where she'd spent 3 miserable years. "I'm ready for the responsibility of trying to fix a broken system. The consequences, both good and bad, were set in motion by the people who chose corruption over justice." Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You have no idea what you've done or what's coming next. Some secrets are kept for good reasons. A concerned friend." Sophie showed the message to Dr. Thompson, who frowned with recognition. "Whitmore's not going down quietly. He's going to fight this with everything he has, and he won't be particular about the methods he uses. Let him fight. I have something he doesn't." "What's that?" Sophie smiled grimly, thinking about the original contract still locked in her safety deposit box, about the additional evidence she'd compiled but not yet revealed, about the network of allies she'd built through careful planning and moral courage. "I have the truth. And for the first time in 3 years, I'm not afraid to use it." Outside, Seattle's skyline glittered in the evening light, the same view she'd stared at during countless humiliating meetings in Whitmore's conference room. But now she was no longer the overlooked junior associate dismissed as dead weight. She was the person who'd brought down one of the city's most powerful institutions. The war was far from over, but Sophie Martinez had finally learned to fight. 6 months after the FBI raids that brought down Whitmore and Associates, Sophie stood in the conference room of Thompson Legal Ethics Foundation, reviewing case files of other whistleblowers who needed guidance. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd gone from being dismissed in corporate conference rooms to leading strategy sessions in a nonprofit dedicated to fighting exactly the kind of corruption she'd exposed. The newspaper clippings on Dr. Thompson's wall told the story of the intervening months. Whitmore indicted on federal conspiracy charges. Sterling Technologies accepts $2.3 billion settlement. Congressional hearings expose decades of legal corruption. Sophie's testimony before the House Judiciary Committee had been particularly devastating. Her methodical presentation of evidence leaving no doubt about the scope of the conspiracy. "How are you adjusting to life as a public figure?" Dr. Thompson asked, settling into the chair across from Sophie with the morning's mail. "It's surreal. Law students recognize me on the street. I get invited to speak at conferences, and reporters still call for quotes about legal ethics. Sophie gestured to the stack of speaking invitations on her desk. 6 months ago, I couldn't get Richard Whitmore to listen to a single idea. Now, everyone wants to hear what I have to say. The personal transformation had been as dramatic as the professional one. Sophie's confidence had evolved from quiet determination to commanding presence, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd stared down corruption and won. But the victory had come at a cost she was still calculating. Any regrets? Dr. Thompson's question was gentle but probing. Sophie considered the question seriously. I regret that it took so long. I regret that people were hurt while I was gathering evidence. I regret that the legal system was so broken that one junior associate with a smartphone could expose decades of corruption that should have been caught by oversight agencies. The morning brought news that vindicated Sophie's decision, while highlighting the scandal's ongoing consequences. The Washington Post reported that federal prosecutors had expanded their investigation to include 3 other major law firms with suspected ties to the data harvesting conspiracy. Over 200 cases were being reviewed for potential misconduct, with millions of dollars in settlements already overturned. James Morrison's name appeared in the positive coverage. He'd launched his own boutique firm specializing in ethical corporate defense, with several former Whitmore Associates joining him. His cooperation with federal investigators had earned him immunity from prosecution, while establishing his reputation as someone willing to prioritize integrity over profit. James called this morning, Dr. Thompson reported. His firm wants to partner with us on a pro bono initiative for victims of corporate misconduct. He specifically requested that you lead the project. Sophie felt a surge of satisfaction. James had found his courage when it mattered most, and now he was building something better from the ruins of their corrupt former workplace. But not everyone had found redemption. Richard Whitmore's fall had been spectacular and complete. Criminal charges, disbarment, the dissolution of the firm that had been his family's legacy for 3 generations. Amanda Sterling had negotiated a plea deal that avoided prison time, but required the restructuring of her company under federal oversight, her reputation permanently tarnished. I got a letter from Whitmore yesterday, Sophie said quietly, pulling an envelope from her desk drawer. He's awaiting sentencing, facing up to 15 years in federal prison. Dr. Thompson raised an eyebrow. What did he say? That I was naive to think exposing corruption would actually improve the system. That I'd just driven the misconduct deeper underground while destroying the careers of innocent people who worked at the firm. Sophie's voice carried a trace of the doubt that still occasionally surfaced. He said I'd won a battle but lost the war. Do you believe that? Sophie looked around the Foundation's offices, bustling with activity, as lawyers and investigators worked to expose other instances of corporate corruption. Phone calls from whistleblowers came in daily, each representing someone who'd found the courage to speak truth to power because they'd seen what Sophie accomplished. I believe corruption adapts and survives. But I also believe that every exposure makes it harder to hide. Every person who chooses integrity over comfort makes the system a little more honest. Sophie's voice strengthened with conviction. Whitmore spent 20 years believing he was untouchable because people like me were too scared or too powerless to challenge him. Maybe the next generation of corporate lawyers will think twice before crossing ethical lines because they know dead weight can be dangerous when it finally decides to drop. The afternoon brought Sophie's favorite part of her new role, mentoring young lawyers who found themselves in situations similar to her own. A first-year associate from a major Portland firm had discovered evidence of billing fraud but was terrified of the professional consequences of reporting it. I keep thinking about my student loans, about my family's expectations, about how hard I worked to get this position, the young lawyer confided during their video call. What if I'm wrong? What if I destroy my career for nothing? Sophie remembered her own fears, the sleepless nights spent calculating the cost of doing what was right. Let me ask you this. Can you look at yourself in the mirror knowing you're complicit in fraud? Can you sleep knowing that clients are being overcharged while you stay silent to protect your career? The question hung in the air, as powerful for Sophie to ask as it had been for her to answer 6 months earlier. What if I end up like you, unemployable in traditional practice, dependent on nonprofit work, constantly looking over my shoulder for retaliation? Sophie laughed, surprising them both. You mean successful, respected, Doing work that actually matters while helping other people find their courage? If that's unemployable, I'll take it. As the call ended, Sophie reflected on the transformation that had brought her to this moment. She'd gone from being dismissed as dead weight to becoming a leading voice in legal ethics reform. Her testimony had influenced pending federal legislation. Her story had inspired dozens of other whistleblowers to come forward with their own evidence of corruption. But the most satisfying change was internal. Sophie Martinez, the overlooked junior associate who'd spent 3 years swallowing humiliation and injustice, had learned to use her voice with devastating effectiveness. She'd discovered that competence and integrity, when combined with courage, could topple institutions that seemed imperviously powerful. The phone rang as she prepared to leave for the day. Thompson Legal Ethics Foundation. This is Sophie. Ms. Martinez, this is Rebecca Chen, a second-year associate at Harrison & Associates in San Francisco. I think I've found something you need to see. Sophie smiled as she reached for her notebook. The work continued. The fight expanded. And somewhere in a federal prison, Richard Whitmore was probably cursing the day he dismissed his most dangerous adversary as dead weight. Justice, Sophie had learned, was not a destination but a process. Messy, ongoing, and dependent on ordinary people finding extraordinary courage when it mattered most. 2 years after bringing down Whitmore and Associates, Sophie stood at the podium of University of Washington's School of Law's graduation ceremony, looking out at 247 newly minted lawyers who would soon face the same ethical challenges that had once seemed impossible to navigate. The irony of addressing graduates from the same institution that had initially rejected her job applications wasn't lost on her. When I was a junior associate, Sophie began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed auditorium, I spent 3 years being told that my work didn't matter, that my perspective was irrelevant, that I was, and I quote, dead weight, in a system designed for people with better connections and more prestigious backgrounds. A murmur rippled through the audience. The story of Sophie Martinez had become legend in legal circles, but hearing it from her directly carried different weight. I want to talk to you today about the difference between competence and comfort, between justice and job security, between building a career and building a legacy worth leaving behind. In the front row, Dr. Sarah Thompson smiled with the pride of a mentor watching her protege fulfill her potential. Behind her sat James Morrison, whose ethical law practice had grown to include 12 attorneys, all committed to the principle that legal excellence and moral integrity weren't mutually exclusive. 2 weeks ago, President Martinez signed the Corporate Ethics Transparency Act into law. Sophie paused as applause erupted from the audience. This legislation, born from the scandal that destroyed my former firm, requires unprecedented disclosure of relationships between law firms and their corporate clients. It establishes mandatory reporting of potential conflicts of interest and creates federal protection for legal professionals who expose corruption. The law bore Sophie's name, the Martinez disclosure requirements, though she'd fought against the designation. She'd argued that systemic reform shouldn't be associated with individual personalities, but Congress had insisted on honoring the courage that made the legislation possible. But laws are only as effective as the people who implement them. You, the graduating class of 2027, will be the first generation of lawyers to practice under these new standards. The question isn't whether you'll face ethical challenges. The question is whether you'll have the courage to choose integrity when it costs you something. Sophie's gaze found Marcus Webb in the audience, whose book, Dead Weight: How One Lawyer Exposed America's Largest Legal Conspiracy, had spent 18 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. The journalist had become an unlikely friend, their shared experience of choosing truth over comfort, creating a bond that transcended professional relationship. I've spent the past 2 years working with the Thompson Legal Ethics Foundation, and I can tell you that corruption thrives in silence. It feeds on the assumption that ordinary people, junior associates, staff attorneys, public defenders drowning in caseloads, don't have the power to challenge institutional misconduct. The audience was completely silent now, sensing they were hearing something more than a standard graduation address. But here's what I learned in those dusty archives where my former boss banished me. The most powerful weapons against corruption are often hidden in plain sight. Careful documentation, Methodical research. The patience to build an unassailable case before you strike. And most importantly, the recognition that individual courage can spark systemic change. Sophie's voice strengthened as she reached the heart of her message. Some of you will join major corporate firms. Others will start your own practices or work in public service. Wherever you land, you'll encounter pressure to compromise your principles for advancement, to stay silent about misconduct to protect your position, to prioritize billable hours over justice. She paused, remembering her younger self sitting in another audience, dreaming of a legal career that seemed impossibly distant. When that moment comes, and it will come, remember that competence without conscience is just sophisticated corruption. Remember that the legal profession exists to serve justice, not just wealth and power. And remember that sometimes the people dismissed as deadweight are the ones with the strength to hold up the entire system. The standing ovation lasted nearly 5 minutes. As Sophie left the podium, she was approached by a young graduate whose eyes held the same mixture of idealism and uncertainty she remembered from her own law school years. Ms. Martinez, what if we're not brave enough? What if we see corruption but we're too scared to act? Sophie smiled, remembering Dr. Thompson's guidance during her own darkest moments of doubt. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the recognition that some things are more important than your fear. Start small. Document what you see. Build relationships with other ethical practitioners. Find mentors who've walked this path before you. She handed the graduate her business card. And remember, you're never alone in this fight. The Thompson Legal Ethics Foundation exists to support people exactly like you when you find the courage to speak up. As the ceremony concluded, Sophie walked across the campus where she'd once been rejected for positions that went to less qualified candidates with better connections. Now law schools competed to offer her teaching positions, major firms sought her consultation on ethics compliance, and congressional leaders called for her input on legal reform initiatives. But the transformation she was most proud of wasn't professional. It was personal. Sophie Martinez had evolved from someone who absorbed injustice into someone who fought it systematically and effectively. She'd learned that being underestimated was often an advantage, that patience and preparation could overcome any disadvantage of birth or background. Her phone buzzed with a text from a former colleague at Whitmore Associates, one of the few who'd survived the firm's collapse with their reputation intact. Saw your speech online. Richard Whitmore died in federal prison last week. Thought you should know. Sophie stared at the message, feeling a complex mixture of emotions. Whitmore's death closed a chapter on the corruption he'd represented, but it also served as a sobering reminder of how completely the scandal had destroyed lives and institutions. She typed back, "Thank you for letting me know. I hope his family finds peace." As Sophie walked toward her car, Seattle's skyline stretched before her with the same beauty that had once mocked her powerlessness in Whitmore's conference room. But now she saw it differently, not as a symbol of what she couldn't reach, but as evidence of what determined people could build when they combined vision with integrity. The next generation of lawyers was about to enter a profession that Sophie had helped reshape through courage and competence. Some would face the same challenges she'd overcome, the same pressure to choose comfort over justice, the same temptation to dismiss their own power to create change. But now they had an example to follow, a path that proved ordinary people could challenge extraordinary corruption and win. They had proof that being called dead weight might just mean you were the strongest person in the room, strong enough to carry the weight of justice when others were too weak to lift it. Sophie Martinez, the overlooked junior associate who'd brought down Seattle's most powerful law firm, drove home through the city she'd helped make more honest, ready for whatever battles tomorrow might bring. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.